biggest financial mistake that project owners make on construction projects in Illinois and other states is failing to understand that there are detailed laws that are passed that dictate how the payment process is supposed to work. These are laws that are generally written that to give project owners the tools that they need to protect themselves from having to pay more money than they're intending to pay. But it's almost always the case, particularly on residential projects, that owners don't understand that these laws exist. And when a homeowner is ignorant of a law that is passed for the purpose of helping them help themselves, not get ripped off by a contractor, not have to pay more money to the contractor or to subcontractors they're attending. If an owner doesn't know that these laws exist and so they don't follow them, the homeowner's going to be disappointed when they wind up in court or when they wind up in an arbitration and they say, to the judge or the arbitrator, geez, I thought I was only going to pay this much, or I thought I was going to get this and not that, or I've got, these subcontractor liens on my property. The arbitrator or the judge that's going to resolve that dispute, really is not empowered to say, well, I know you didn't know about the law and that's fine that you didn't follow it. That's not the way it works. Generally, whoever follows these laws most closely wins in the unfortunate event if there's a claim, if there's litigation. So the biggest financial mistake owners can make on construction projects is failing to understand what the laws are, particularly the laws around the payment process that are there for their benefit. There are laws in Illinois that talk about prompt payment of contractors that have things that might surprise most project owners inside them. There are laws that say that if a contractor makes a payment request to an owner, if the owner doesn't object or raise questions within a certain time period, the payment request is automatically approved by the owner. Even if the owner would have good reason to say, no, you're not entitled to that much money. And so not understanding that you're kind of on the clock when you are given a payment request from a contractor, not understanding you're on the clock as an owner, can be a real problem for you. And these laws, would allow contractors to, stop work without, repercussions, to, suspend their performance or to walk off the job. If the payment request is automatically approved due to the owner's inaction, it can create a situation where the project owner winds up owing statutory interest on top of, the amount that's charged by the contractor. And these, prompt payment laws are out there. They're intended to some great extent, to help owners have predictability. And if you ignore them, you're asking for a lot of financial trouble in your project. There are other laws in Illinois and other states that can require project owners to bypass general contractors, stop paying them, and go to the subcontractors that are actually swinging the hammers and pouring the concrete and make payments to the subcontractors, directly, and that's the kind of thing that would surprise a lot of project owners, particularly residential project owners, homeowners who are only occasional or unsophisticated consumers of construction services. A lot of these laws, are mechanics lien laws. The Illinois Mechanics Lien Act, is really clear that there are certain things that a project owner shall do, they're required to do. And if they do those things for their protection, and a lot of this boils down to what sort of paperwork are you requiring, from the general contractor, and the subcontractors every month, what is the content of that paperwork? If an owner follows these laws, they can really almost entirely guaranteed that they're not going to have to, pay subcontractors money for the same work that the owner's already paid the general contractor for, if for some reason the general contractor never paid the subcontractor, and a lien is put on the project by the subcontractors. These lien laws, these prompt payment laws, they're not so much about fairness or justice as they are about predictability. These laws are not intended to say, let's protect the homeowner from those people that are trying to rip him off. These laws sort of say there are rules of the road, right? And there are rules of the road that subcontractors should follow if they want to make sure that they get paid. And there are rules of the road that homeowners need to follow so that they don't, wind up having to, double pay for the same work. If the GC skips off of their money and the subcontractors lien their projects. And I think that it would shock most project owners in Illinois and other states, whether it's a residential construction project, a home improvement project, or something bigger, that it doesn't matter whether they, have paid the contractor, all the money that was listed out, in their original contractor proposal, that they might wind up having to pay for the same work twice, or they might, have missed their opportunity to complain about an invoice due to an action, or that they might find, that the contractor's walking off the job or suspending performance, and there's a cascade of subcontractor lien claims. There's a whole bunch of financial trouble that project owners can step into if they fail to understand that Illinois and almost every other state has detailed laws that dictate how the payment process should play out. And the way that project owners can, protect themselves against, making this huge financial mistake, the biggest financial mistake that owners can make on construction projects, is twofold. It's educating yourself about what these rules are, but then very importantly, baking into a thoughtful construction contract a requirement that the owner is going to do this, and the general contractor is going to do this, and the subcontractors are going to do this. And this is a process that is spelled out, and it's going to play out, and it's going to be followed so that the owner can abide by these laws that are there for their protection. And they can make sure that they don't wind up owing a lot more money on their project, or find themselves stepping into a situation where they have to pay claims that they otherwise wouldn't have had to pay, if they ran the project differently. So educate yourself about what these rules are, but very importantly, the process needs to be spelled out, very clearly in a thoughtful construction contract, and then followed by project owners who are looking to avoid stepping into, this big financial mistake and putting themselves on the hook for a bad time, either in the form of paying a lot more money than they had intended to pay, or winding up facing claims that they wind up having to pay, not because it's fair that they have to pay this additional money, but because they didn't take advantage of the rules that are there to make sure that loss would fall on some other party.